All have returned. Mr. Durst is present with Mr. Chesnoff and Mr. DeGuerin. We have Mr. Lewin, Balian, Henderson, Milius, Miata for the people. Ladies and gentlemen, just I continue to talk with the lawyers to fine-tune precisely what we're doing with our schedule. So the evidence, all of the evidence will be concluded on Wednesday, okay? The people's argument, we have a few days off between the 2nd and the 7th. Then we'll be returning here on Wednesday, September 8th. The people's argument will begin on that day and will go into September 9. The defense will begin their argument on September 9. Then we get that long weekend, 10, 11, 12. On the 13th, the defense will conclude their argument. The people have the last argument. That's because they have the burden of proof. So they have a closing argument. So they will close on the 13th and concluding no later than noon on the Tuesday the 14th. So you will begin deliberation on Tuesday the 14th. You will deliberate then, and I expect you will deliberate on the 15th. If you are still, the 16th is Yom Kippur. We will not be in session. No one will be here. If you are still deliberating on the Friday the 17th, we will resume deliberations if there is not a verdict. So if you have a Friday plan, bear in mind that I will instruct you to return on Friday the 17th. So beware of that. And so on. I don't tell you how long to deliberate, how long, how short. You are as a body determine how long your deliberation will take. It will take as long as you need. So with that, we'll return to our evidence so we can get back to this. All right, you may resume your cross-examination of the defendant, Mr. Durst.
Thank you. Mr. Durst, the last clip that I played for you, you're aware that you referred to Morris as it, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you were discussing, if you remember in that clip, you were explaining, you said as follows: I went back and I realized I couldn't lift it, I couldn't drag it out, I was going to have to dismember it. Then I went to Chalmers hardware store, and now Morris had tools. He had saws and axes. He had a giant axe. I don't think he had a bow saw. And then you stop, and you literally, you have a smile on your face, and your hands go up, and you go, anyway. Do you recall that? Do you recall that testimony, or do you need me to replay it?
What are we talking about?
So in your, it wasn't testimony. I'm going to play it right now, just the beginning of it. 481, which was just played. I'm just going to play for you the first part of this clip, and I want you to watch. And I'm especially when you say, I don't think he had a bow saw, and then you say, anyway. That's the part I'm going to ask you about.
I went back and I realized I couldn't lift it, I couldn't drag it out, I was going to have to dismember it. And then I went to Chalmers hardware store, and now Morris had tools. He had saws and axes, a giant axe. I don't think he had a bow saw. Anyway, I went and bought a bow saw.
Mr. Durst, in the way that you're casually describing how you were preparing to dismember Morris Black, you refer to him 3 times as it, correct?
Well,
Overall,
is that correct?
when Morris Black was dead, he was a corpse, and I described the corpse as it.
Well, you would agree, Mr. Durst, a corpse is still a person, correct?
I don't know if a corpse is a person. A corpse is a dead person.
And you would agree, Mr. Durst, that as you're describing the tools that he had, you say, I don't think he had a bow saw, and you kind of have a quizzical look on your face, and then you literally stop, put your hands up and go, anyway, in a very casual manner. Did you just see that right there?
I saw that.
Can you explain, Mr. Durst, how you can be so casual when you're talking about the preparations you're making to dismember somebody who was a friend of yours?
Overrule.
I cannot analyze it.
Would you agree that it appears to be somewhat detached and frankly cold?
I don't think anybody would derive anything from me going anyway, like you are doing.
Mr. Doesn't it sound like you're almost telling a story as if you were like building a shed, talking about the tools you have, and then you simply go anyway, and then you move on to your next topic? Doesn't it seem a bit out of place when you're talking about the dismemberment of a human being?
Overrule.
I have no idea how one should talk about a dismemberment.
Where did the bow saw that you used as part of the dismemberment come from?
I believe it came from Morris's apartment.
And is it your position that it was just sitting in a closet?
Yes, all his tools were in a closet.
And would you agree that Morris lived in a very, very small apartment like yours?
He lived in a small apartment. The apartment had a closet with a door that opened and shut.
And it's your contention that Morris Black happened to have the same kind of saw, a bow saw, that you yourself had extensive experience using. Is that correct?
I think there are different kinds of bow saws. I have no idea if Morris's bow saw was the same as the one I bought at Chalmers.
Well, you agree they were both bow saws and very similar, other than maybe the brand name, correct?
They were both bow saws.
And you agree a bow saw is a bow saw, right?
I will agree with you that a bow saw is definitely a bow saw.
And is it your testimony that, again, Morris Black just happened to have this bow saw, the same kind of saw that you had previous experience with, the same kind of saw that you would purchase in New Orleans, allegedly, only days later, the same kind of saw that the police would find brand new and unopened in your Honda CR-V at the time of your October 9, 2001 arrest, and he just had this sitting around in his apartment closet? Is that your testimony?
I don't think a bow saw is a very unusual kind of saw, and that is my testimony.
Was it difficult to cut up Morris Black's body?
I don't remember.
Well, Mr. Durst, given your extreme detailed memory about very innocuous facts, can you explain why it is that you do not remember anything about dismembering your friend's body?
Well, I will tell you what Dr. Loftus said about people who have terrible things happening to them and how they place these things in a place in their brain that they refuse to visit. For 18 years, I've refused to think about dismembering Morris Black. Also, my psychiatrist, Dr. Milton Walschuler, said the same
Objection,
thing.
motion to strike is non-responsive.
Stricken.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that an alternative explanation for you not, quote, remembering what happened with the dismemberment is that you have selective memory and do not want to talk about it.
What is selective memory?
Meaning, Mr. Durst, that it's not that you don't remember it, it's that you understand that it is very incriminating to discuss, and you're just simply claiming a lack of memory when in fact you remember and just don't want to talk about it.
Oh, I don't remember it, and I definitely don't want to talk about it.
Did you injure yourself at all during the dismemberment?
Not that I recall.
And you agree, Mr. Durst, that if you had cut yourself, etc., you would likely remember that, correct?
I don't know if I remember that or not.
Well, wouldn't you expect that when you were arrested approximately 2 weeks later, that if you had suffered an injury to your hands, for instance, you would expect that that would have been noted when you were arrested, correct?
I have no idea.
Would you agree that despite your claimed inexperience and ineffectiveness at dismembering a body, that you were able to very effectively dismember Morris Black's corpse?
The forensics all said that the way I dismembered Morris Black's corpse by cutting through the bone is not the way to dismember a body. Not the way to dismember a body of a human being, and not the way to dismember the body of a chicken. They said you cut around the joints like you do to a chicken.
Mr. Durst, you would agree, though, that however you chose to dismember Morris Black, you were able to successfully do it, correct?
Correct.
And you were asked about this during the March 15, 2015 interview that you had with me, is that correct?
You mean the interview where I was trying to work out a plea bargain with you?
That is how you've characterized it, yes. RD 384, March 15, 2015, pages 99, line 16 to 100, line 2.
Yes.
Excuse me?
You know the way the body was cut. Somebody knew how to cut the joints.
You see, I don't know that. Subsequently, I've been told that a surgeon would cut up a body the same way you do a chicken. You go into the joint and you cut around the joint to get rid of all the ligaments, and then the thing comes out. You're not going to go and try to cut through the goddamn bone like I did, which was hard.
Well, you did a pretty good job. The thing that
Cutting through a bone is not easy with anything.
That's what you said, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that in describing it, you do not sound either remorseful or sad? Is that a fair statement?
Overruled.
You're asking me how I felt in 2015 about something that happened in 2001.
Mr. Durst, I'm asking you, do you agree that when you were describing dismembering your friend with an axe and different saws, that you did not sound either sad or remorseful, correct?
As long as we're prefacing this, that we're talking about 15 years after the incident, I would agree.
Mr. Durst, you went on to explain that the way you dismembered Morris was, quote, the hard way, unquote, correct?
Correct.
RD 537, March 15, 2015, page 100, lines 7 through 17.
I know that cutting up that body the way I was doing it was the hard way. The proper way is what a surgeon would do with a scalpel, and he would cut around the ligaments and then do it in the joint, not on the bone.
Would you agree, Bob, that somebody who could dismember somebody like that, you can understand why we would suspect you of having killed him?
That's what Kathy, mother, and what Gilberti, and I'm sure the other ones think. I give it Kathy.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that before I could even finish my question of indicating would suspect you of having killed you interrupted me and said on your own, yeah, that's what Gilberta and Kathy's mom think I did to Kathy, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you answered that because in fact that's what you did do to Kathy, isn't it?
Overruled.
Oh, no. I did not kill Kathy, and the thought of dismembering her makes my skin crawl.
Does the thought of dismembering Morris make your skin crawl?
No.
Mr. Durst, if you had dismembered Kathy, would you tell us?
Yes.
Overruled, the answer may stand.
Did you testify under oath during the Galveston trial that prior to walking over to Chalmers and walking back to the apartment and dismembering Morris Black that you drank almost an entire bottle of Jack Daniels?
I drank almost an entire bottle of Jack Daniels while I was dismembering Morris Black.
Can you put up, please, Galveston Trial 102703, page 112, 116, 237, lines 4 through 10? Question. Now, did you do this cut up before you had the fifth of Jack Daniels or after you had the fifth of Jack Daniels? Answer. After I had the fifth of Jack Daniels. Question. You drank the whole fifth and then started cutting almost all of the fifth? Yes, sir. Is that what you testified to?
Yeah.
You also testified, Mr. Durst, that you bought this fifth of Jack Daniels at Economy Liquors for the explicit purpose of getting your nerve, courage, etc. up to dismember your friend. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you specifically said it was a fifth of Jack Daniels. Is that correct?
I mean, was it a fifth or a quart?
Well, you said
I really don't remember.
Well, Mr. Durst, isn't it correct that you said a fifth of Jack Daniels, correct?
I should have said a bottle. I don't remember if it was a fifth or a quart.
Well, Mr. Durst, you said unequivocally correct. It was a fifth of Jack Daniels, correct?
What are we talking about?
What I just played for you, what I just read to you in Galveston, you testified that you bought a fifth of Jack Daniels at Economy Liquors, and you drank it, correct?
This is something I said at the trial. I don't know what I'm saying.
So what you're saying is, you're telling me that you're saying you admit you said you drank a fifth of Jack Daniels, but you're now saying you don't know if that was accurate? Is that your testimony?
Yes, I'm saying right now, I don't know who the fifth or a quart.
Repeat that, I'm sorry? You agree, Mr. Durst, that a quart is even bigger than a fifth, correct?
I agree.
So, I'd like to mark, Your Honor, for demonstrative purposes, the following. This is a fifth of Jack Daniels. Mr. Durst, this is a fifth of Jack Daniels whiskey, correct? Is that correct, Mr. Durst?
I assume
Well,
so.
examine it if you want. Take a look.
I don't need to examine it.
Well, this is a fifth of Jack Daniels, correct?
Correct.
Now, Mr. Durst, what did you weigh at the time in Galveston? How much did you weigh?
I think I weighed my maximum about 150 pounds.
Well, Mr. Durst, you would agree that this fifth of Jack Daniels is going to give you between 20 and 30 shots of whiskey, correct?
I'll accept that.
Well, Mr. Durst, even at 150 pounds, how on earth could you have downed 20 to 30 shots of whiskey, walked to and from your Galveston apartment, and then dismembered Morris Black's corpse?
I'll repeat what I've said many times. I remember taking big chugs from the bottle of Jack Daniels, and I remember spitting up a whole bunch of times, and I remember taking a lot of showers.
Now you took a lot of showers, is that correct?
Correct.
Originally, you didn't take a shower at all, correct? Originally, you didn't take a shower at all, correct?
I don't know what you mean by originally.
Mr. Durst, is there any way, are you telling this jury that you believe you could have ingested that amount of liquor and then dismembered a corpse with saws and an axe? Is that your testimony?
That is my testimony.
Does that in any way, Mr. Durst, forget about seeming reasonable, when you listen to that testimony, does that even seem possible to you?
I said I kept taking chugs from the bottle of Jack Daniels, and I kept spitting up.
You were asked about this during your Galveston trial on October 27, 2003, page 112, 116, 237, lines 11 through 20. You were asked the following. Question, how does a fifth of Jack Daniels impact you generally? Answer, generally, I don't drink a fifth of Jack Daniels. Question, how did it impact you that way as far as being able to walk over to Chalmers or cut up Morris Black? Did it cause you any problems? Answer, I don't know. Question, you don't remember? Answer, I don't remember and I don't know. That was your testimony, correct?
Correct.
Did you say at that point in time, I didn't actually drink a fifth of Jack Daniels?
No, and I
Did-
think there was almost no Jack Daniels left in the bottle, which I threw out at some point.
Did you say, Mr. Durst, at any time during that statement I just read to you that you were spitting it up constantly?
That's, I do think when I testified in Galveston, I said that I was vomiting a lot.
Were you drunk when you dismembered Morris Black?
I guess.
You guess? All right, Galveston trial 102703, page 115, 116240, lines 14 through 16. Question. Well, you were drunk then all afternoon while you were cutting up Morris Black. Answer. I hope so. Yes, sir. That's what you said, correct?
Yeah, I do hope so.
Mr. Durst, do you believe that if you would have been drunk from consuming a fifth of Jack Daniels whiskey, that you would have been able to dismember a corpse?
I did it.
You would agree, Mr. Durst, there's another alternative, correct?
I guess.
Would you agree that another alternative would be that you're making up the Jack Daniels, that it never existed, and that you never drank Jack Daniels and were never drunk when you dismembered Morris? That would be another alternative, correct?
Overruled.
Another alternative would be that I drank a fifth or a quart of J&B.
Mr. Durst, wouldn't that put you flat on your back? That amount of liquor?
I just said no.
After you finished the bottle of Jack Daniels, what'd you do with it?
I threw it out.
Well, Mr. Durst, you're aware that no bottle of Jack Daniels was ever found during the investigation, either in the apartment, in the trash, or in the bags in the bay, or floating in the bay, correct? You're aware of that?
I am not aware of that.
Well, I want you to assume for a moment, Mr. Durst, that the testimony in this case from Sergeant Gary Jones,
No,
from...
we have the stipulation, we'll put it up.
Oh, let's put it up, that'll be easier, thank you.
People's 183, page 8.
People's 183. Okay.
Do you see there were no bottles of alcohol found within this trash can container, and that's the trash can container that came from your apartment that had the gun, etc. You agree that's what it says, correct?
Correct.
After dismembering Morris Black's body, you said you put his body parts in trash cans and dumped them in Galveston Bay, is that correct?
Correct.
And you also triple bagged each one of these, correct? Meaning you put one bag...
That is what the forensics say. I do not remember triple bagging them, and I don't think I had that many garbage bags.
Well, Mr. Durst, you would agree that the bags were found, and they were all found triple bagged together, correct?
I don't think they were all found triple bagged.
You heard the testimony, and in fact the stipulation regarding how the bags were found, correct?
I don't think they testified that all the bags were triple bagged.
Do you recall, as an example, Mr. Durst, that there was only one set of bags that had any holes in them, and that was triple bagged, and it had what looked like rips, large rips, in each one of the bags that were wrapped up in each other? Do you recall that testimony?
No.
Do you recall the testimony, Mr. Durst, that the only body part of Morris Black's that was not found was his head? Do you recall that?
I recall that.
You believed that the body parts were going to sink or would be pulled out into the ocean, correct?
I believe they would sink.
That didn't happen, did it?
They floated.
You did not have any understanding of how the tides worked in Galveston Bay at that time, did you?
I never had any understanding about how the tides worked in Galveston Bay, ever.
And in fact, Mr. Durst, you saw the bags after you dumped them, they began to wash up on the shore, correct?
Correct.
And that caused you to panic, didn't it?
I don't know if I panicked.
Well, Mr. Durst, were you aware that inside the bags were, among other things, a newspaper that had the address of where Morris Black lived?
I was not aware of that.
You were concerned, though, Mr. Durst, that if Morris Black's body was recovered, particularly his head, that number one, they would be able to easily identify him, correct?
Correct.
And you were also concerned, Mr. Durst, strike that. You would agree, Mr. Durst, that if they recovered Morris Black's head, that if you had shot him in the back of the head and not the front of the head, that would be revealed, correct?
Correct.
You heard the testimony of Galveston County Sheriff's Diver Randy Burrows regarding the extent of the search that was conducted and the recovery of Morris's dismembered body parts, correct?
Correct.
And you specifically heard his testimony about the 3 green trash bags which were found knotted and enclosed inside one another, each bag of which contained a large 30 to 36 inch rip, correct?
I don't believe he testified that each bag was triple bag.
Do you recall him testifying, Mr. Durst, that he found 3 bags that were knotted within each other, and that each one of these bags that were tied together had an approximately 30 to 36 inch rip in them? Do you recall that? Okay.
I remember they testified that the bags had rips in them.
Stipulation 57, please. Thank you, Mr. Balian.
183? Okay.
Starting on line 14, Sergeant Jones then went to the coroner's office and was present when the bags were opened and inventoried by Dr. Charles Harvey. Each of the 3 bags containing body parts consisted of a bag tied with an overhand knot, within a bag tied with an overhand knot, within a bag tied with an overhand knot. In other words, the bags were, quote, triple bagged and tied. You recall that, correct, Mr. Durst?
Well, I recall it now.
And he went on to describe how these various bags contained different body parts, correct?
Correct.
Can you explain, Mr. Durst, why the only body part that wasn't found was Morris Black's head? Can you explain that?
No.
And it's your testimony that you placed Morris Black's head inside of these bags, and then you threw it off the pier along with the other body parts in the bags, correct?
Correct.
You dumped everything in the same place, correct? It's not as if, oh, you dumped Morris Black's head in a different part of the bay. You threw everything off at the same time, correct?
Correct.
Now, Mr. Durst, you also heard the testimony of Dr. Ben Hodges, correct? Do you recall his testimony?
No.
Dr. Hodges testified that in his opinion it was not a possibility that the head was deposited in the bags and then either floated away or sank. Do you recall that testimony?
Is this the guy who had a ponytail?
Yes.
I recall the testimony.
Do you recall that Dr. Hodges also testified that the large 30 to 36 inch tears in each of the 3 garbage bags, which were bagged inside of one another and which we know contained Morris Black's blood, were not torn as a result of either the natural actions of the ocean or the activities of any animal he is familiar with in the water? Do you recall that testimony?
I don't recall the testimony, but I do accept that he said that.
So given that evidence, do you have any explanation as to what happened to Morris Black's head?
No.
Is it still your testimony that you did not go back and remove the head from the bags when you saw them washing up on shore?
I did not go back and swim around in the ship channel looking for the bag that had the head.
Are you aware, Mr. Durst, of ships that operate in ankle or knee-deep water?
I think the bags were adjacent to the ship channel, which is much longer than ankle or knee deep.
Mr. Durst, didn't you hear the testimony of Sergeant Burrows and of the stipulation of Gary Jones that related that the bags were found on shore, that they had floated up, and that nothing made it anywhere near the shipping channel. You recall that testimony and those stipulations, correct?
I don't think he said that. Where I threw the bags was directly next to the ship channel.
Mr. Isn't it true that you recovered the head and then wrapped it in a blanket?
No.
Isn't it further true that you then drove with that head towards New Orleans and dumped that head in some unknown spot between Galveston and New Orleans?
No.
Objection. 352, speculation. 765A.
Well,
Cumulative.
What?
overruled?
Isn't it further true, Mr. Durst, you don't dispute that you dropped off a blanket with a red stain at Young's Dry Cleaners in New Orleans on October 8th, 2001. Is that correct?
The quilt that I took to the dry cleaner did not have a red stain. I think the dry cleaner got confused by the decoration on the quilt.
Mr. Durst, you were asked about this on cross-examination during your testimony in Galveston. Is that correct?
I don't recall.
Strike that, not during cross-examination, during direct examination on October 20th, 2003, page 59, LADA 165784, lines 7 through 16. Your attorney asked, but in addition, what you find in this car is a receipt from a dry cleaning company in New Orleans. You answer correct. Question, now you trace that receipt for the dry cleaning company and you, let me back this up, I apologize. You were present, Mr. Durst, when there was testimony at trial that the blanket had a red stain on it. Is that correct?
I was present when the detective decided that the design of the quilt had a red stain. I am also aware that they were never able to get any DNA on that red stain. As a result, they could not prove that it was a red stain.
Well, Mr. Durst, why would you take a quilt or a blanket to the dry cleaners with a red stain on it if in fact what was a red stain wasn't actually a stain? Why would you do that?
I bought the quilt at a charity auction. They had quilts that were made as if they had been designed by various artists. They had a Rembrandt quilt, a Picasso quilt, and a Jackson Pollock quilt. I bought the Jackson Pollock quilt.
Mr. Durst, why would you bring, in the middle of fleeing from Galveston, you're not disputing that on October 8th, you dropped off the blanket with the red stain at Young's Dry Cleaning in New Orleans, correct? You don't dispute that, is that correct?
I dropped off the quilt that was designed as if it could have been painted by Jackson Pollock, who was known for drip painting.
Listen to my question. You are not disputing that you dropped off that quilt or blanket at Young's Dry Cleaning in New Orleans on October 8th, 2001, correct?
It was a quilt, and I'm not denying that I dropped it off at the dry cleaner on October 8th.
And you agree that there was a red stain that was on the quilt, which was the reason that you dropped it off, correct?
There was no red stain.
So, Mr. Durst, you're in the middle of, you've just jumped bail in Galveston, correct? I mean, withdraw that, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Let me withdraw that. That's an incorrect question on my part. You have taken off from Galveston, and you are on the run on September 8th.
I had left Galveston. I had not taken off. I was not on the run.
Well, Mr. Durst, you have dismembered Morris Black, dumped his body parts into the water, seen his body parts float up on shore, you've cleaned out his apartment, and you've taken off from Galveston to head to New Orleans to your second identity as Diane Wynn, correct?
Correct.
So, Mr. Durst, you would agree that the next day, October 9th, the day after you dropped off the quilt or blanket in New Orleans, you're going to be arrested in Galveston after you pick up your eyeglasses, correct?
But that is not something that I knew in advance.
Understand that, Mr. Durst, you didn't know you were going to be arrested, but my question is this. You're in the middle of trying to get away from a killing and a dismemberment in Galveston, and yet you're going, you know what, sounds like a good time to take my blanket, which doesn't have a stain, into the cleaners to have cleaned. Does that make sense?
I brought more than the one quilt to the dry cleaner. It had no red stain.
Well, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that the receipt that you had in the car only listed a blanket?
I don't know.
Well, let's put it up. This is going to be People's 184 from, I don't know, this is from Galveston or it's R184.
This would be our 184, page 1.
Okay? Here's the receipt, Mr. Durst. Do you see it? This is Young's Dry Cleaning in Louisiana, correct?
Correct.
It says the address, correct? Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans?
Correct.
It says one blanket, correct?
Correct.
Under PCS, which you agree stands for pieces, it says one, correct?
I don't see what you're referring to.
What's that?
I do not see PCS.
PCS is going to be, it's right there. You see it says by the number 1, the PCS is in the form, and then it's marked 1. Then it has the date, and it says 10801 next to it. Do you see that?
One, I see the one.
By the way, you gave a phony name, correct? It's not your real name, is it?
Is that the name there, Perrin?
Parent. Is that the name you gave?
Don't remember.
Well, this was in your car when you were arrested the next day, correct?
The receipt, yes.
And you're the one who dropped it off at the dry cleaners at 4114 South Claiborne in New Orleans on October 8th, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, can you explain why you would be dropping off the one blanket at the dry cleaners when you were on the run from what you had done in Galveston?
I was not on the run.
How would you characterize, Mr. Durst, what you were doing when you left Galveston after having been involved in Morris Black's killing, having dismembered him, having thrown his parts in the bay, having cleared out his apartment, cleaned up your apartment and his apartment? What would you call that if not being on the run?
I don't know what I would call it, but I was not on the run. If I was on the run, I would not have gone back to Galveston to get my eyeglasses.
Well, Mr. Durst, you would agree you are arrogant. You're an arrogant individual, correct?
I am a what?
Arrogant, A-R-R-O-G-A-N-T.
Well, you and Miriam Barnes are in agreement. She said I was an arrogant asshole. I would not agree.
Well, Mr. Durst, you're saying that why would you have gone back to Galveston if you were on the run? But Mr. Durst, that's exactly what you did and it got you arrested, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, would you agree that the reason you went back to pick up your eyeglasses in Galveston is, in addition to being arrogant, you are incredibly cheap?
I am
Yep,
cheap.
sustained, 352.
I don't see how you put the cheap in here.
Well, Mr. Durst, you're returning to Galveston to pick up eyeglasses. Why are you doing that?
Same reason I took the quilt to the dry cleaner.
And by the way, you're saying
It was
that
an errand that needed to get done.
One moment, Your Honor. Mr. Durst, it's your testimony that the quilt was it was like a Jackson Pollock quilt, is that correct? In a Jackson Pollock pattern, is that right?
Correct.
I'd like to mark, Your Honor, the following image as people's next in order.
You've displayed it to counsel?
No.
Display it to counsel.
Okay.
Mr. Durst, when you described
Relevance? Oh,
Mr. Durst, when you described that the quilt looked like a Jackson Pollock painting, can you describe what you meant by that? What did the quilt look like?
I said it was a quilt to look like it could have been designed by Jackson Pollock.
I want to show the following image, and can you tell me, is this what you mean? This is an image of a Jackson Pollock painting.
Oh, that's not the quilt.
No, that's not the quilt, but is that what you mean by the style?
Yes, he was famous for doing quote-unquote drip paintings.
And this could look like, if you didn't know better, and you didn't know it was the pattern, this could look like maybe that's blood on there, is that right?
But that was not the quilt.
Correct. My question, though, is no matter what the quilt looked like, you knew that whatever the pattern was on it, it was not actually blood, correct?
Correct.
So if you knew that it's not actually blood, what would be the need of having it cleaned?
I had bought the quilt about 3 weeks before at a charity auction. It had sat out for people to handle to decide which quilt they wanted to buy. I wanted to get it cleaned because I did not like the idea that numerous people had been handling the quilt.
So your testimony is you don't have it cleaned when you buy it. You wait until after you've dismembered Morris Black and you're on the run from Galveston, and then it comes to you, you know what, I should probably stop at the dry cleaners in New Orleans while I'm on the run and have my quilt cleaned? Is that your testimony?
Same thing with the eyeglasses. I had no reason to go back to Galveston to get the eyeglasses. I had not paid for them yet, except that it was convenient. They had already given me the eye exam, and I was having difficulty reading the freeway signs on the freeway.
Mr. Durst, it's been argued that what you did to Morris after he was killed has nothing to do and sheds no relevant information on how he was killed. Is that your contention as well?
I don't know about has no relevant information on how he was killed.
Mr. Durst, haven't you previously stated on numerous occasions that the fact that you dismembered Morris Black after he was dead has nothing to do with any of the circumstances of how he died? Haven't you repeatedly said that?
Yes, that was repeated at the trial frequently, that you cannot unstrike a match. You cannot unring a bell. And once Morris Black was dead, there was nothing I could do to make him not dead.
But would you agree, Mr. Durst, that if somebody either in self-defense or accidentally kills somebody, that to then go and dismember that person would seem to be a highly incriminating act?
Objection, argument. Reconsider.
I'll sustain it.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that when a person accidentally kills another person, that person goes to the police?
That's argument lost.
Kills a person, he goes to the police. Overruled.
I have no idea.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that when a person accidentally kills someone or kills someone in self-defense, that it doesn't make sense that they would then dismember the corpse?
Objection, same objection.
What's the objection, Your Honor?
It's a, no, argument of 352. So it's sustained.
You would agree that Morris Black was a loose end to you, correct?
I have no
Overruled.
idea what you mean by a loose end.
Mr. Durst, you previously testified that the only person who could connect you, your name, Robert Durst, with Avenue K, you've agreed it was Morris Black plus the two tellers, Jessica something, and the other one, correct? Those are the only people that you've mentioned that knew you were Robert Durst and could connect you to the apartment on Avenue K, correct?
I always wondered if the landlord, Klaus Dillman, knew who I was. And the same thing with that man at the Jesse tree.
Well, Mr. Durst, whether you wondered whether they knew who you were, the only person that you knew for sure who knew who you were and could connect you to Avenue K was Morris Black, correct?
The people I just mentioned
And would
may
you
have known for sure.
would you agree that his death took away the only person other than the two bank tellers you've described who you knew could connect you, Robert Durst, to the Avenue K apartment, correct?
I just said, in addition to the two bank tellers, the Jesse Tree man and the landlord, Klaus Dillman, very possibly knew that my real name was Robert Durst.
Listen very carefully, Mr. Durst. I didn't ask you to speculate on who might have figured out who you were. I'm saying by your own testimony, there are 3 people in Galveston who knew you were Robert Durst and that you lived on Avenue K. One is Morris Black, and 2 are these bank tellers that you just for the first time revealed during your cross-examination at this trial, correct?
I think in the past I have said that I thought Klaus Dillman and the Jesse Tree person knew who I was.
Do you agree, Mr. Durst, there's a difference between you thinking somebody might know who you were, might possibly know who you were, versus knowing that someone knew who you were? Is there a difference between those 2 scenarios?
I don't know if there's a difference or not.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that it's an unfortunate result for you that the person, Morris Black, who you have admitted for a long period of time knew who you were, knew that you were running from New York, and knew that you were living at Avenue K, that he happened to allegedly die in an accidental shooting?
Objection, how do you like to do?
Overruled.
The thing of it is, except when I was in Galveston, everything I was doing as Robert Durst. When I flew from New York to San Francisco to Eureka, I did that all as Robert Durst. I used my credit cards repeatedly. I used my cell phone repeatedly. And obviously, if Janine Pirro and her hundreds of lawyers and investigators wanted to find Robert Durst, they would not need to go to Galveston.
Well, Mr. Durst, if you were in Galveston when they were looking for you, since you were not using your cell phone in Galveston, since you were not using your credit cards in Galveston at any place that could connect you to Avenue K, then you would agree, Mr. Durst, that they would not have been able to locate you without Morris Black's assistance, correct?
No, not correct. I think if the police were looking for me and suspected I was in Galveston, they would find me very, very, very quickly.
How would they know, Mr. Durst, how would they suspect that you were in Galveston? You're not using your cell phone. BD Story says you're not using any credit cards. You did not use your cell phone. You didn't even use the cell phone and credit cards in California. You only used them in New York, correct?
No, I use my cell phone in California, and I use my credit card in California. And this morning, you accused me of taking $9,500 out of the Bank of America in Eureka.
Mr. Durst, does taking money out of the bank in Eureka, does that require you to use your cell phone?
No,
Does taking the bank out of Eureka, did they have your Galveston address?
no,
And you agree, Mr. Durst, you have said that you stopped using your cell phone when you fled New York and went to Galveston, and you didn't start using again until after Susan Berman's murder in January of 2001, correct?
Susan Berman's murder was in December of 2000.
Well, Mr. Durst, you have previously said, and the records are in evidence, that you stopped using your cell phone approximately November 11th of 2000, and you didn't begin using it again until January of 2001. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, how did you use your cell phone in California, Mr. Durst, when you said you left it on the plane?
November 11th, 2000 is when the media announced that Janine Pirro was going to get Robert Durst. By December 7th or 8th, I had decided that Janine Pirro was probably going to do nothing. And I left Galveston and started living my life as Robert Durst.
Except, Mr. Durst, you have previously, and the phone records support it, stipulated that the records are accurate that show no use of your cell phone at all in December of 2000. Correct?
No, not correct.
So you're saying, Mr. Durst, that there are cell phone records that demonstrate that you were using your phone in December of 2000, your cell phone. Is that your testimony?
Correct.
All right, we'll come back to that. Do you agree, Mr. Durst, that the only evidence there is to support your version of what occurred with respect to Morris Black's killing is your word about what happened? Would you agree?
I thought the forensics pretty much said that my description of what happened was confirmed by the results.
Which description, Mr. Durst? The inconsistent statements you've given at Galveston, which didn't even match up with your own animation, your inconsistent statements in testimony here versus your statements in Galveston? What evidence are you referring to?
Sustain.
At the time of your arrest outside of the eye doctor on October 9, 2001, there was an unopened bow saw in the car, correct?
Correct.
Why did you have that?
Well, you're going to tell me that it's unreasonable and illogical, and that no normal person would do it. But I was going to hide my car in New Orleans, just like I had hid my car when I went to Galveston.
In fact,
I
Mr.
needed the bow saw because there was a logging trail I wanted to drive on where I thought I could leave the car. And there was a branch across the logging trail which I needed to cut out.
In fact, Mr. Durst, you testified in Galveston that you attempted to dump your Honda CR-V on an old logging trail about an hour outside of New Orleans, correct?
No,
What is incorrect about that, Mr. Durst?
I intended to hide the CRV on a logging trail outside of New Orleans. But I needed to saw this branch away so that I had access to the logging trail.
And in fact, what you testified to is this logging trail was about an hour outside of New Orleans, correct?
Correct.
And you further testified that what you did is you attempted to dump the car on this logging trail, but it didn't work because of the branch, correct? There was a tree trunk
Correct.
blocking the road. Is that right?
Correct.
So you instead drove all the way back to New Orleans, purchased a bow saw from a hardware store in the city near your apartment with the intention of going back to that same logging road, apparently sawing the tree and then leaving your car there. Is that correct?
Correct.
By the way, how are you going to get back from this logging road in the middle of nowhere?
I was going to hitchhike.
You were going to hitchhike from a logging road in the middle of nowhere. Is that your testimony?
From the logging trail back to the apartment that I had rented in New Orleans.
Well, Mr. Durst, so couldn't you have dumped your car almost anywhere?
No.
Why didn't you just look for another logging road close to the other one that didn't have a tree blocking it and simply dump the car there?
Well, dumping the car was sort of stupid and unreasonable. Looking for a different logging trail would be equally stupid and unreasonable.
Mr. Durst, isn't it true that before you could even testify to this story today, on your own, before you could even get it out, you elected to say to the jury, in essence, Mr. Lewin, you're going to basically say that my story is illogical and unreasonable. On your own, you in essence attacked your own story before you could even tell it. Is that correct?
Overruled.
The story is not illogical and unreasonable. What I did was illogical and unreasonable.
In fact, Mr. Durst, after all that, you went back and bought the bow saw. You never even dumped the car where you said you were going to dump it, correct?
I think I got arrested.
You think you got arrested? You drove to New Orleans and you bought the bow saw, correct? That's what you've testified to.
Yes, I drove to New Orleans. I bought the bow saw. I checked out the logging. Actually, I drove to New Orleans. I found the logging trail. I bought the bow saw. I went back to Galveston to get my glasses, and I was arrested.
So, Mr. Durst, you had to drive by the logging trail again that you were going to leave your car at, but instead of leaving the car on the logging trail as you planned, you decided to drive back to Galveston. Is that correct?
Correct.
Does that make sense?
I just told you that you would end up criticizing me for doing all these stupid things that don't make sense.
You actually,
But that is what I did.
and you actually told this story under oath in New Orleans. Is that correct?
You mean in 2015?
No. During your trial, under oath, you told this story about wanting to dump the car in the old logging trail and you were going to saw the branch down. You told
During which trial?
your Galveston trial, Mr. Durst.
Correct.
All right. While you were on the lam from Galveston after you jumped bond, so now this is going to be after you're arrested, you get bond, and you're on the lam at that point, correct? Where did you go when you first left Galveston?
To New Orleans.
Did you end up going to rent a car in Mobile, Alabama?
I rented the car in Mobile, Alabama after things are getting out of order. Morris Black died. I drove to New Orleans. Then I drove back from New Orleans to Galveston and got my eyeglasses, and I got arrested. And I made bail, and I got released. And I went to New Orleans on the Greyhound. And I went to my apartment, and I realized I had no car, because when I got arrested in Galveston, they took a Honda CR-V. And when I made bail, they did not give the Honda CR-V back to me. So while I was in New Orleans, I looked up in the yellow pages for car rentals, and several of them had ads that you could rent a car without a credit card or a license. So I rented a car in New Orleans. I cleaned out a few things that were in the apartment in New Orleans, and I drove to Mobile, Alabama. The car I rented in New Orleans was falling apart. It was making very strange noises. So I went to the rent-a-wreck in Mobile, Alabama, and I rented a wreck, and I drove it to Pennsylvania.
You rented that car, a Chevy Corsica, from Rent-A-Wreck in Mobile, Alabama on October 17, 2001, correct?
Correct.
And whose name did you put on the rental agreement?
Morris Black's.
Wasn't it traumatic for you to be using the ID of the friend that you had just killed and dismembered?
I did not kill him. The only ID I had was Morris Black's Medicare card. That was the ID I used for Rent-A-Wreck.
And Mr. Durst, did you end up after you left Mobile, did you ever drive out to the West Coast, or did you focus your attention on the Pennsylvania, New York, New England area?
The media had me in California at Diane Boucher's campground. I always figured that Diane Boucher had given that story to the media in order to help me escape. I never went to the West Coast.
So during the time that you...
I drove due north from Mobile, Alabama to Pennsylvania.
During the time that you were on the run from roughly October 18, 2001 to November 30th when you got arrested, you used a number of aliases of people that you had known over the years to check into different hotels and motels, correct?
Yes, it was a real problem. Because when I checked in the motel, I had to fill out the form. So I would scribble something. Some of them asked for ID, and if they asked for ID, I would tell them that it's in the car. I'll bring it in when I go to the room. Most of them were fine with that, and they gave me the keys to the room, reminded me to come back later and give them my ID. Some of them wanted to see the ID right away. In those cases, I would tell them it's in the car. I would go out into the car and I would leave.
Now, you
It
stayed,
became a big problem because in several of the motels, I forgot what I had written down, so I didn't know who I was supposed to be.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our break until 3:15. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form